Extra special thanks to Cincy Music for co-hosting My Favorite Album is Terrible. For the best in what Cincinnati's amazing local music scene has to offer, be sure to follow them on Instagram at Cincy Music, that's Cincy with a Y, on Facebook at cincymusic.com, also Cincy with a Y, and on their official website, www.cincymusic.com. Here's the show. Good evening. I'm Kent Mulcahy with the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. Welcome to tonight's My Favorite Album is Terrible, the music show where we discuss misunderstood, unloved, or overlooked albums. As always, everything that we talk about tonight is going to be available to you freely with your library card. Please make sure you check the comments for links to everything that comes up in tonight's discussion so you can keep up to date on everything that we are talking about. Make sure you join us in the comment section if you have thoughts on tonight's album or you have ideas for other albums that we should talk about in future episodes. And very importantly, if you enjoy what you're watching, please give us a like and definitely give us a share. Especially share us with some folks who you think might be particularly interested in music discussions with generally a Cincinnati-ish slant to them. So help us get the word out. We love seeing the audience grow each and every week. Well, tonight's guest is none other than Paula Brehm-Heeger, the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library's Eva Jane Romaine Coombe Director. A Cincinnati native herself, before becoming director in 2018, she had worked in libraries for over 25 years here and elsewhere, including various leadership positions in our own system. Aside from being a music fan, which is why she's on the show, she also enjoys swimming, running, and as an aspiring triathloner. I don't think triathloner is a real word, but I'm just going to go with it. So we're going to be talking about a couple of different things with Paula tonight. But of course we're going to be talking about music and a specific album. So what album did Paula choose? Paula wanted to talk about Bob Dylan's 1976 album Desire, which, by the way, is available to you through our Hoopla service. Bob Dylan, who am I to really offer thoughts on Bob Dylan? Everyone's definitely heard that name. Literally one of the biggest figures in popular music that you could possibly name. And it's one of those situations where whether or not you listen to this kind of music generally, you've heard Bob Dylan's music. It's been in millions of movie soundtracks and in every indie movie. In the main character's apartment, you're going to find a Bob Dylan poster or a Bob Dylan album cover somewhere to establish that character's smarts or, cool credentials. So, we'll get into this in the discussion, but for a lot of folks, Bob Dylan is a greatest hits kind of guy, and that's understandable. Just so many albums. I think he has almost 40 albums at this point. So, for a lot of folks, it's just, like the hits, there's enough to digest there. But of course, there are the Bob Dylan super fans, and they hang on every word, every line that he has ever sung, ever spoke, ever written. And for the super fans, each one of them has their Bob Dylan album that they think is the best, and they have their reasons for why they think it's the best. But even so, even in discussions with a bunch of different super fans, you kind of see the same Dylan albums popping up over and over again, which is why Paula wanted to talk about Desire. She kind of feels like that not enough folks are pegging Desire as, the Bob Dylan album, like, one of the best Bob Dylan albums out there. And, looking around, it's definitely well received by critics. So it's not like this is an unloved album. This falls a little bit more into the overlooked category. There's a few reasons for that hopefully we'll get around to, but this album doesn't have like a Blowin' in the Wind or a Mr. Tambourine Man. It takes a little more listening. This one might focus a little more on lyrics than melody. Who knows what the reasons are. Paula is bringing a second special guest onto the show with her tonight. She is going to bring Scott Bauer on. Now located in Madison, Wisconsin, Scott has been a reporter for the Associated Press for 25 years, and he is actually a Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library alumni. He attended his first Bob Dylan show in 1988, which was around the time that he started working as a shelver for the library. In 1990, Scott was on the very first Green Township branch team when that branch opened. A little later, Paula herself started working as a shelver at Green Township, and according to Paula, Scott showed her her first Bob Dylan tape. Yes, cassette tape, which was her introduction to Bob Dylan. And by the way, that tape came from our library's collection, which is a pretty cool connection there. Later in 1990, they went to a Bob Dylan show together, which according to Scott was not Mr. Dylan's finest moment. Okay, so let's get to the discussion. Before we bring Scott on, Paula and I are going to discuss a few of the big changes, the really exciting changes coming your way to your downtown main library branch at the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. If anyone stopped by, you've seen there's a lot of construction going on. We're super excited to talk about the changes coming to our branch. You are going to love them. And there's a lot of implications for things that we will be able to do in the future at our downtown main branch. All right, let's bring on Paula. All right, Paula Brehm-Heeger, thank you so much for your time. How's your evening going? Your very bright evening outside.
It's going great. Thanks for asking. I'm thrilled to be here talking with you tonight, Kent.
Yeah, great to have you. So we have a ton to talk about. Obviously, we're going to talk about music. We're going to talk about Bob Dylan. But I'd like to start with something kind of seemingly not music related, but I have a way I'm going to tie it back in. I'll get us safely back to the music realm. We got a lot going on at Maine. Anyone that's been at Maine the past couple of weeks, all sorts of construction going on. We've got major projects that we're all super excited about. What can you tell us in, so much, a couple of minutes, what's going on at Maine in the future?
Sure. Well, as part of our facility master plan, the Main Library is going to be undergoing some initial maintenance, then some renovation and changes that folks will see really over the next 18 to 24 months. So right now, if they came on down today, they would see a big scaffolding in our south building atrium area. That has to do with maintenance we're going to be doing on the skylight, and we're also doing maintenance on the elevator. Both of those are elements of this cool building that are aging and need some replacement and some repair. So that will be going on here in our first phase. You'll notice that you can't get into the Vine Street entrance. That's because all of this work is going on right there. So folks do need to come in currently to the Walnut Street side. Over time, we will then begin to do some more major renovations, particularly on the first floor of the south building. Right. That will include both the outside plaza area as well as the first floor inside area. And at that point, we likely will be closing the south building. That'll probably be in the early fall. And so we recommend that everyone get used to coming over to the north building and entering off 9th Street. That's an active building. We'll be offering all of our services just on a slightly different kind of scale, right. But we will have access to the collections. People can come on down, and our drive-thru will also remain open during that time period as well. So we have a lot going on. They'll see those changes. The front of the building on the Vine Street side will really look quite a bit different when we're done, and they'll see that happening.
Yeah, and they may hear the changes going on while we're chatting, because I'm just a little ways over from that scaffolding you were talking about. It's, very, very exciting. This is a tough question because there's so much cool stuff happening. Is there a particular element, I don't want to say your favorite, but one thing you're particularly excited about with the changes at Maine?
It's very hard to pick one thing. Obviously, The plaza outside area is going to be great. Court Street is leading the way on making it very pedestrian friendly here in the business district. But I also know, Kent, that the social stair and the staircase that we're looking at putting there in the atrium is very exciting. Will really change things. If you haven't been to the library in years, or if you were here when you were a kid, you may remember we had that giant card catalog. Well, that's not what we need anymore to access information. So we're going to make use of that space that was really built for the card catalog and put in a very cool social stair.
Yeah, which, when the social staircase was explained to me, it was like, in high school and middle school, everyone just hung out on the steps outside of it. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a very cool thing to bring in. And, doing a music show, it's obviously what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking to the future of events, maybe having some more live music here at the downtown library again. So.
Oh, yeah, we're hoping that social stair will be able to function as sort of something of a stage, or definitely an area where people could sit. We're going to have a totally different feel down there, a lot more space for people to socialize, collaborate, and kind of be together or separate depending. So lots of great things going on, Ken.
And where can folks go to keep tabs on all this stuff coming up?
The easiest thing to do is, of course, go to our website, cincinnatilibrary.org/next dash generation. These are all sort of part of our next generation library improvements.
All right, so everybody make sure you check that out. Thank you, Paula. All right, and with that, let's get back to music. And you've brought a guest along, a friend. So let's take a pause here and we will bring on Scott Bauer. All right, Scott Bauer, thanks for jumping in on this. Thanks for giving us some of your time. How are you doing this evening?
Great, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm ready to talk about some music. Before we get to Dylan, I wanted to start with both of you. Let's go back past Bob Dylan for a second, and I'll hijack the conversation for a brief second to just talk about me. When I listen to these albums for this show, a lot of times I'll do it in the car when I'm taking my kid to daycare. He's 3 years old. And a lot of the times he has ended up loving them, much to my chagrin, in some cases where like all he wants to do is listen to Smash Mouth All-Star right now on repeat. That didn't work out for me. When I tried to play Bob Dylan in the car for him, wasn't having it. He was like, can we listen to something else, Dada? And so I would switch it. And the next day I was like, let's listen to some music, Max. And he goes, okay, but not that man. And I was like, that's fair. So it's clearly not going to be his first album that was his. Paula, what was your first album that was yours? You discovered it, not your parents, like one of the first songs or albums, like this is mine and I love music.
Well, probably Peter, Paul, and Mary's Greatest Hits. I think I found that album somewhere at my house, and my parents had a great, at the time, very modern album record player, which I'm very sad that they actually got rid of because that would have been the coolest. So I can remember playing that, and I always think that was a precursor to my later love of Bob Dylan because, of course, there's a big connection there, and some of, Dylan's music is really present there. So I would have to say, as geeky as that is in the 70s, so perhaps it's appropriate, probably, that trio.
Right. Scott, same question.
Yeah, there was always a lot of music around my house with older brothers and my parents listening to albums. But one that sticks out in my mind is the Monkees. I think it was their Greatest Hits, and that got a lot of play on my my little bedroom record player at the time.
It's so funny. You hear that in a lot of musician interviews. Like the Monkees come up more than you think they would, and in genres you would not expect that the Monkees would come up. They always come up. All right, so let's jump back to Paula. So what was your introduction to Bob Dylan?
Well, I have to give credit to Mr. Bauer because we were, of course, shelvers together at the Green Township Branch Library back in the day. And I remember you gave me a tape. It was Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits Volume 2, and someone had returned it.
Volume
and
2.
I believe that you handed that to me. And I can remember then driving home from Green from at my house in Delhi at the time and going the hairpin turns, listening to that and thinking, now this is something, because that's not necessarily the music you hear at that time played on the radio or a lot of access to it. That was a different kind of Bob Dylan sound.
And did your car have the feature on the cassette player that auto-flipped the tape so you didn't have to do the dangerous thing of flipping it?
I don't think so, Ken. I'm not sure. I think that was a little bit beyond. That might have been a Nova at that point who did not have that level of technology, perhaps.
Well, I'm sure you were very careful. All right, Scott, same question to you. What was your introduction to Bob Dylan?
Yeah, I think mine was through my older brother who actually saw Bob Dylan live in 1981 at Music Hall. Okay. And he gave me his Greatest Hits on cassette, and I remember listening to the first volume. This one, Ken.
I was going to say with the blue cover in the background,
right.
Yeah.
This one.
Iconic.
So I remember listening to that in my dad's truck with him and just thinking to myself, like, what is this crap? I mean, this is just terrible. Like, right. I can't, well, what is it? And then I kept listening to him like, well, that one song's pretty good, and that other song's pretty interesting. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, I kind of want to hear more from this guy, So it was the Greatest Hits pulled me in at a pretty young age. I'd say probably when I was around 14.
Definitely my introduction, and I'm like you. I had my son's reaction. I was like, who is this old man singing? But it was, I think, Positively 4th Street was the one on that Greatest Hits collection where I was like, there's a melody here. The other ones don't, at first I didn't think they had melodies. So that brought me on, and then I moved along, and, Highway 61 became my Bob Dylan album. So, Scott, when you moved on from the Greatest Hits, was there what was the first album that spoke to you in full?
Right. So, well, unfortunately, becoming a Dylan fan in 1986 was not a great time for current Bob Dylan music. I remember my brother was in college at Miami, and they had the latest Dylan record out for sale, and it was this one, which almost no one has, Knocked Out Loaded. Um,
No, I don't.
don't get it. Don't get
Okay.
it. Trust me. So yeah, it's not very good. So it wasn't until yeah, and of course through the library, I was working then at the Cheviot branch, and I remember going there and checking out a number of older Dylan records that they had there, Nashville Skyline, and the some of the Blonde on Blonde, and those early '60s, mid '60s ones. But the first like current Dylan album that came out that really I felt like, okay, now there's like one that he put out that I actually like currently was Oh Mercy in 1989.
Oh yeah, yeah, kind of a
And
comeback. Yeah,
yeah, and so that one was this one.
that one right there. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the first one that like I felt like here's some current Dylan music I can actually recommend to people to listen to as opposed to the older stuff.
Yeah. No, Paula, you got Greatest Hits Volume 2, interestingly. I don't know what the track listing was on Volume 2 off the top of my head. When you moved on, was Desire, did it happen to be the first full album you fell in love with? Okay, I was going to ask. I was guessing no. What was that one?
No, it was definitely Blood on the Tracks because, I never really had the initial, what is this with Bob Dylan? I just really kind of relate it right away. And I have to say that Idiot Wind remains,
Oh.
it's a masterpiece of just, not comfort, but something that is really interesting. And the turn of phrase there is just fascinating. So those kinds of things are right at the top of my mind. I definitely agree with Scott about Oh Mercy. And I have to say that being a amateur Dylan person who reads a lot of stuff and probably doesn't understand most of what the musical elements are, I think Dan Lanois produced Oh Mercy, right? And he
Did.
really can bring out the best in some other folks who had albums that didn't quite bring forward their full talent. And I think that one really is both Bob Dylan's comeback, but it's a great masterpiece from Dan as well. And I've seen him in concert a couple times. He's sort of someone who is a great editor, but not a great writer. He's not really the best performer. We have several of his albums and a lot of his music at home, and it's not compelling to me the way Bob Dylan is, but man, he can bring out the best in other artists. It's kind of fascinating. So that's a whole nother podcast. We could talk about Dan Lanois and all he does for music. But I think Oh Mercy, I listened to that today in prep for this when I was walking around downtown, and I listened to Everything Is Broken, and boy, that song has unfortunately got some real legs in the world today. But that's just an amazing album.
And that speaks to Bob Dylan. I mean, we were talking before we hit record how many of his songs, for better or worse, apply today just like they did then. So when we were discussing what album we were going to pick, and you said, you listed a few, and then you were like, but maybe we should do Desire because it kind of gets lost in the shuffle of some of his other records, like Blonde on Blonde, like Blood on the Tracks. And, I agree, it's very, very critically well received, so you can't put it in the unloved album category. So there we go, there's the album cover. Coming through. I won't have to go and re-edit and add album cover splashes to this. You are saving me so much time. So critically well reviewed, do you have any guesses as to why maybe it's not, every time you ask a superfan, what's your favorite album? Desire isn't the one that comes up as often? Lyrics, maybe not as much melody? Any reasons on that?
I think you're a Dylan fan if you like Desire, and if you don't like harmonica or mouth harp, forget it. It's just, the music is difficult for people who don't like Bob Dylan to take, and right out of the gate with Isis. I mean, there are so many people in the world that you put that on and they just will go, yeah, we're not listening to that, because it is full on, and it's a bizarre sort of song if you don't listen to it. I sometimes like to try and get people to listen to the live version. I think it might be on one of the bootleg, where I think he's in Canada, and he starts it with the whole, this song's for Leonard, if you're still here. And that's a kind of a wacky song, and I think it doesn't take itself quite so seriously. So sometimes I try that. But, Desire is not not for everybody, and I would never use it to say, if you haven't heard Bob Dylan, why don't we try this one? I would never do that to someone.
Yeah, I could easily see there's so many songs where it's like da 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 I said da 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 she said da 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 he said, and it's just there's no real hooks, there's no real chorus. It's like one long verse, and I mean, you take that on face value and it sounds like I'm slamming the album, but I'm not. But yeah, like you said, I think if you're not careful, this album really does sound like what everyone thinks Bob Dylan sounds like overall. And I don't know, Scott.
Well, I mean, it's also got, and Scott, you can probably speak a little bit maybe from the musical side. It's got like the violin, like an electric violin is also not for everyone. And, I'm sure Kent, Emmylou Harris does a lot of vocals in the back, and they're not always fantastically done. And if you read some of the scuttlebutt on that album, he's not necessarily, or at that time, necessarily the easiest person to work with. So she never really fully understood her cues. And if you listen to Hurricane in particular, there are times where, she's coming in and you think, oh, I don't think that's quite right. So it's a musically chaotic album, but I think he sounds great. I think it's an album that really, his voice is so well suited, and I think he does a great job on that album vocally. That's just me.
Yeah, no, I mean, but like you said, you've got to kind of like Bob Dylan to get to the point of where saying he does a great job vocally means something different to a lot of different folks. And so, Scott, just generally, your thoughts on the album, where it fits in, kind of the same question. Why maybe people aren't going to go, oh, Desire over Blonde on Blonde or Highway 61?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Paula said about it. I actually think it's somewhat more accessible than a lot of his other records, especially, if you want to find some records where it fits the stereotype of what Dylan sounds like. I think there are others that would be more suited to that. I think Desire's got a great exotic sound, because of the violin, because of the co-writing with Jack Levy. He was doing a lot of kind of more theatrical type songs. And it comes during that Rolling Thunder period in the mid 70s where Martin Scorsese just has a documentary out about that. That's fantastic. I highly recommend it. But again, it's like any kind of art. I feel like you gotta give it a chance, and you've got to break out of maybe what you think music ought to be sometimes to appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking.
And the last track on that album, Sarah, doesn't quite fit with the rest of it. And I think that he recorded that with his then wife, Sarah, in the studio. And there's sort of awkward stories about how she was less than thrilled about the entire situation. And I think that their marriage broke up soon thereafter, pretty much. And, Isis is, per Dylan, a song about marriage. But if I were going to get someone to listen to Desire, I might start with Sarah, because it's a much different kind of song. It's slightly shorter, and it's much more understandable, and it's not so fantastical in its lyrical elements. It's like actually just him talking to Sarah. So it's interesting, too, that the album has some differences in the songs if you listen to it enough and can make it through them all.
Well, you definitely jumped right ahead to the literal next question I was going to ask of what's a good entry point for the album, because Hurricane's 8 minutes and 30 seconds long. Then you've got Isis, which is 7 minutes long, may not be the best entry point. So in a second, Scott, I'm definitely going to ask you the same point for an entry point question. But you had mentioned, Scott, the Rolling Thunder period. Just a total side note, in the bootleg series he does, there's a really great, I don't remember if it's 5 or 6 in the series, but documents the Rolling Thunder review concerts. So I highly recommend that as a live recording. So what about you, Scott? If there was someone who'd never heard this album, what's the track that you would just, right off the bat, dive in here?
I mean, I love Isis. I think Romance in Durango is a great one. Any of those, I think they all kind of have that same kind of mood and feeling. I wouldn't recommend Hurricane. I think that's kind of its own thing. And that's probably the one song that if anybody would be familiar with would know, just because of the movie and it was on the soundtrack. So those would be the ones I would say.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think my pick for the uninitiated would have been Romance in Durango, and I hadn't thought of Sarah in that way, but just with a couple of sentences of backstory, yes, you're right. That is a really great introduction. So since we're talking about introducing people to this album, Bob Dylan's one of those interesting people. There's no one who's like, meh, about Bob Dylan. It's like you either, yes, I love Bob Dylan, or you hate him. I guess the middle ground is someone who just owns that greatest hits album that you flashed up on the screen for a second. So aside from this album for a second, let's go back to Paula. Someone's never heard Bob Dylan. They've heard of Bob Dylan. They maybe push play for a couple of seconds, and they're like, no, it's not for me. What do you say? You're like, no, go back. Drop the needle again. Listen for this and this and this. How would you get them to your side?
Well, really you'd have to talk to the person because, as Scott alluded to, Bob Dylan's music is radically different all along his trajectory. And again, sort of in prep for this, Ken, I think you mentioned Time Out of Mind,
yes.
Which is a late 90s album. And as I'm hitting 50 this year, boy, that album is really about, I think somebody in midlife could listen to some of those if they're up for it. And really there's a lot of exploration about grief and regret. Mm-hmm. And it's not dark yet, but it's getting there, and
I was
trying to get to heaven before they close the door. Those are all songs that I think you give that to somebody who's 22, unless they've had a really rough situation, I'm not sure they're going to fully appreciate the things he's saying. And anybody who might not like Bob Dylan's music but has read anything about him, or sort of his journey in life, his journey with his audiences, would probably appreciate that kind of attitude he has there, where it's really post-caring very much about many things personally or professionally in there, but in a way that isn't as harsh as some of his earlier lines would be, I would think. So, but there are other people that might really have never listened to some of his sort of weirder, ironic songs like Talkin' Bear Mountain Picnic. If you got somebody who wants something short and weird and really is into like irony and cleverness, those are great songs that don't take long to listen to, and I bet most people have never heard them.
No, and I think that one was actually on the first, they put the bootleg series 1 through 3 together. I think that one was snuck way in there. Man, Time Out of Mind, we should just do another one. I bought that the day it came out, and I was like 17. And I'd listened to Not Dark Yet, and I was like, I'm moody, I like sad songs, so I did like that one. But there you go. It might be my favorite Bob Dylan album. I don't know how that tracks, but I hit 40 last year, and in the middle of a pandemic, I probably listened to Not Dark Yet a little too much. But boy, does he get that song absolutely right.
It's funny, Paula referenced earlier, Oh Mercy being seen as a comeback record in 1989, which it was. And then Time Out of Mind, 1997, comeback record yet again. And then his most recent Rough and Rowdy Ways, comeback record. So he's one of those guys who's been around long enough, 50 some years, they have multiple comeback records. And there were ones prior to that, that got labeled that way.
Yeah, I was, you had mentioned, you sent a couple of emails back and forth. You mentioned the new album. I'll admit, I haven't heard that album yet. There's just a lot out there. And seen as a comeback album. But, it really got me thinking. He's up there. It is. There it is. He is up there in age. Like, for him to have another comeback album, there would have to be another long period of a few good albums, and then some forgettable ones, and then another great one. And maybe if he goes out on this one, maybe that's going to be, that's a good one to go out on. But yes, you did totally get ahead of another question I was going to ask. So Scott, I'll go back to start on this one with you. We kind of talked about how do you get someone initiated to Bob Dylan, and the lyrics come up a lot. Obviously, I don't have to go on and on about how he's a well-known lyricist. Everybody knows that. Do you think? How many of his albums do you think stand on their own musically without his lyrics over top of them? Do you think there's a wealth of them, or is that definitely just part of why he works?
Yeah, I mean. I think it's the whole thing that you've talked about, the voice being an impediment and all these different things. And I I used to really argue with people about that and really fight back on that point. And I think, in this American Idol kind of pop music culture we've been living in, what a lot of people think is good vocals is this kind of technically perfect, pitch perfect, hitting the high note kind of thing. And to me, what's more important is the emotion and is the feeling and is the ability to tell a story in a way that's maybe more unique. And I think with Dylan, a lot of his songs, I'm not a musician, but I think musically, a lot of his songs are not that complicated. But he's able to, do things with the words and with the music together in a way that really nobody else can.
Yeah.
And so I think, or has, and so I think, and his career is so long and so there's so much variety that it is like, for a new person, it's kind of daunting in a way to say like, well, where do I even start with, 50 years? Do I go to the greatest hits, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, the ultimate collection, to this, to that? I mean, there's a million different things they can pull down. But I guarantee you within all of that, there is something that would speak to everyone or most people. They may not become a Bob Dylan fan, but there are songs that Make You Feel My Love is a very accessible song that a lot of people have covered. Not one of my favorites, but people really like it. So there's numerous examples like that.
Yeah, but it speaks to him that he can write a song like that. That in a way, it's like a cheesy pop song. What was it? Adele covered it. Or Garth Brooks maybe, and it takes skill to do that. Yeah, I always thought the vocal thing was funny. I remember when my friend first showed me Bob Dylan, I was like, I hate it. I hate his voice. My main genre, I still listen to death metal all the time, and I'll never forget my friend. He goes, "You don't like his voice? You're literally wearing a Cannibal Corpse shirt right now. They sound like Cookie Monster singing." So yeah, it is an unfair standard. So looking at the time, kind of move a little bit to the outro section. Let's go back more general a little bit with a very tough question. Let's go back to Paula for a second. What is your favorite concert you've ever attended? And if you can't name favorite, what is one that just jumps out at you first?
Well, I recently went to see Bob right before the pandemic when he was at NKU, right? He was over there, and I couldn't believe the crowd, which was kind of heartening because Scott and I have seen Bob when there was like you and somebody's parents in the whole big place, like during those era when he really wasn't putting out a lot of well-known music, and he was at that point not seeming to be in love with the never-ending tour. But this time, I do have to say he was great. Place was packed, and much like some of that music he started to put out in the late 90s, where you just get the feeling this guy's done worrying about it. He's cool with what he's doing. He's leaning into where he's at. He's never going to stop touring. He was fantastic. I have to say, he was really much better than he'd been for many shows prior to that. So I don't know that I would say, oh, that's my favorite of all time. But since it just happened and we're talking about Bob, and it was an amazing crowd, he was really impressive. So I have to give him great credit for that too.
Does he still do the thing? Because the couple times I saw him, after every song, the whole band would pause and just like take a break to stare at the crowd for a second. It was very off-putting, but also it was a baller move, and I don't know if he still did that or not.
Well, now I feel like maybe he needs a moment to get up off of the bench. I mean, he still moves around a lot, but there is a lot more pausing, and I don't know if it's quite for that reason or if he just needs a moment.
I didn't think of that. Yeah. So, Scott, as a journalist, you review music a lot. I'm going to broaden it for you. Maybe not your best concert, but I'm going to assume you went to a lot of concerts. Do you have a favorite live act in general?
Well, I mean, that'd be a whole nother podcast to talk about the Grateful Dead. So we'll have to hold off on that because there really was nothing like a Grateful Dead show. But in terms of live acts, I mean, Dylan, again, to keep it on point here, I've seen him a number of times over a number of years, and really every time is different.
Yes.
Different bands, different feel. It's the Never Ending Tour, which a name that he rejects, but that people have attributed to it. And so there was a Dylan show I saw in October of 2001, so about a month after 9/11. And Love and Theft, his record, his follow-up to Time Out of Mind, came out on September 11th, 2001. And so I saw him in a small venue in South Dakota in October 2001, and that was one of the most incredible Dylan shows I'd ever seen. Um, Most of the crowd didn't know the songs. They were, you could hear a pin drop in there, the new songs. And it was a month after 9/11. Yeah, I think it was the first crowd I had been around, not unlike coming out of this pandemic where people were kind of freaked out for a while. But he put on a hell of a show, and it was really something.
Yeah, that would have been a good. He just has a knack for being there when he needs to be there in the world. All right. So this is more just a fun thing. Paula, if you were to look at your phone, your media player device, Spotify, if you were to hit play on the most recent thing you were listening to, that was not for this show, by the way, not research for the show, would we hear a book, a podcast, an album? What would we hear?
Well, it would be a bunch of podcasts. I've been listening to some podcasts on the presidential. Some of you may know this podcast series. It's fascinating. They're like 20 to 45 minutes. So I've been working my way through that. Yeah. And then there's a follow-up podcast called Constitutional. And so when I walk a lot or I'm around, I like to listen to those. Kind of keeps my mind going. And, they're not exactly exciting, but that is what I have been listening to a little bit recently.
That's great. What about you, Scott? What would we hear if we hit play?
I just finished up a great podcast called Welcome to Your Fantasy that was about the history of the Chippendales dancers of all things. And, if you think or you think you may have a vision of what that story may be, I would implore you to listen to that podcast and you will be fascinating story.
That is right up my alley. I like this Slate podcast called Decoder Ring, and they just take cultural monoliths and tell you everything about them that you did not know before.
And Ken, I have to just kind of here before we leave, I do have to also, speaking of podcasts and weird Bob Dylan being places where other people end up later, Scott, I don't know if you remember that you found that A.J. Weberman album at that old joint, that record joint off Short Vine. Remember that?
Yep.
And that was the weirdest, talk about a weird Bob Dylan moment where, Ken, are you familiar with that album?
No, not at all.
So A.J. Weberman is a self-proclaimed Dylanologist who would do some really crazy things before social media that now would be very typical of a provocateur or someone who, does kind of weird things. And he would record Bob or go through his garbage. And he called him and he recorded the whole thing and then people put it on an album. And so it's really weird. And listening to that in the 90s before people were recording people, it is crazy to listen to because they do a whole, probably 1/4 side of the album, 30-minute talk. And then Weberman stops his tape to flip it. So, earlier you asked me about flipping a tape, if there was auto flip. Weberman flips the tape and then they get back on and Dylan is just livid. He's like, are you recording me? What are you doing? And he just completely goes off. And Weberman then someone put this out. So, there's all kinds of weird things, but sometimes when I think about social media, I think, man, I had no idea that in the future, this would be much more commonplace. But at the time, it really felt weird to listen to someone's personal conversation in that way and leave it to Bob Dylan to be the subject, of that kind of thing way before it was all the rage.
Yeah. Again,
do you still have that album? Do you? Yeah.
Well, I will have to, once we're off of here, I'm going to check our two music services, Freegal and Hoopla, and see if it's on there. I
don't think it's exactly a sanctioned sort of situation.
No, it doesn't sound like it. We have a lot of good stuff. We may not have that one.
No, and we have a lot of Bob Dylan. I was listening to everything I talked about today on Freegal, so plug for the library. That is true. I was listening to all of it, so you can get lots of great items that we talked about today through the library, of course.
Or just knock on Scott's door because it seems like he has everything he did on vinyl, probably. There you go. And
CD.
Everything. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, both of you. Scott, any final words you want to say before we let you get back to it?
No, there's a lot to explore there, and don't let your preconceived notions about Bob Dylan stop you from checking some of it out.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. Paula? Last thoughts?
No, I think it's great. And special thanks to Scott, who, is obviously a bit of a Bob Dylan expert in some circles and also a former library staffer. So there's a weird overlap there that you never know who else on library staff might be a Dylan fan as well.
Yeah, the morning of the recording, you were like, he's going to be on this, and he's an expert. And I was like, I hope I can keep up with this. So, well, thank you both very much. Have wonderful evenings. And yeah, just thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us. We definitely appreciate your time, and we obviously appreciate Paula and Scott's time. With credentials like those, you know they are busy folks, so we absolutely appreciate that. As a reminder, if you want to go back and look into everything that came up in tonight's discussion, please check the comments where I will put direct links to everything. You can put a hold on it with your Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library card and get caught up to speed on that. Also check the comment section where I will be doing the big reveal of who our guest will be 2 Thursdays from now right here on Facebook Live at 8 p.m. So check that out. And lastly, thanks again to Cincy Music for helping us get those episodes out there. Make sure you're following Cincy Music everywhere you can possibly follow them so you will not miss the best interviews with local Cincinnati artists and also what shows are coming up and when. So again, thank you so much. Have a great Thursday evening and have a great weekend, and I'll see you 2 Thursdays from now. Good night.